You can tell a lot about a person by the way they look at you when they think they have power over you. The first thing I saw that night wasn't the police lights. It was the reflection of them bleeding across the lake outside my cabin window like red and blue oil floating on black water. I was standing at my kitchen counter slicing open a bag of coffee beans while rain hammered against the tin roof hard enough to shake the old rafters overhead. The clock on the stove said 2:11 a.m. and the smell of wet pine drifted through the screen door I'd forgotten to latch after bringing in firewood. Then came the crunch of tires over gravel. Slow. Deliberate. More than one vehicle. I set the coffee down without rushing because nobody drives 6 miles up a private mountain road in western Montana after midnight unless they're either lost, drunk, or looking for trouble. The headlights swept through the trees first, long white beams cutting across the fog rolling over the shoreline. Then the sirens chirped once. Short. Controlled. Not an emergency. A statement. I walked to the front window and saw 2 county sheriff SUVs parked outside my cabin with their light bars flashing against the rain. And standing between them in a cream-colored raincoat was Patricia Holloway. Even from 40 feet away I could recognize that posture. Arms crossed. Chin tilted up. The posture of somebody who had never once in her life expected to hear the word no. She pointed directly at my cabin while one of the deputies listened to her. I cracked the front door open and cold mountain air rushed inside carrying the smell of wet dirt and pine needles. That's him, Patricia snapped before I could even speak. He's the man occupying protected HOA property. One deputy stepped forward carefully, boots sinking into the mud near my porch steps. Evening, sir, he said. We received a report about trespassing and unlawful occupancy. I looked past him toward Patricia. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled despite the storm, like she'd planned this entire performance hours in advance. Unlawful occupancy? I repeated calmly. I own this cabin. Patricia laughed immediately, loud enough for the deputies to hear it over the rain. You people always say that, she said. The board has records proving otherwise. You people. Funny phrase. I'd heard versions of it my entire career. Usually right before someone realized they had badly misjudged the room they were standing in. I opened the door wider and motioned toward the lights inside. Deputy, it's freezing out here. You want coffee while we sort this out? Patricia looked irritated by that. She wanted tension, fear, resistance. Instead she got a 52-year-old man in flannel holding a coffee grinder. The younger deputy adjusted his flashlight and glanced past me into the cabin. His eyes lingered for half a second on the metal lockbox sitting near the fireplace before he looked away. Mind if we ask you a few questions first? He said. Not at all. Patricia stepped closer, heels sinking into wet gravel. You should also ask him about the firearm inside, she added quickly, and the suspicious radio equipment. I almost smiled at that because the radio equipment she was talking about was an old encrypted field receiver sitting beside my bookshelf. The funny thing was 3 weeks earlier, I'd personally signed the federal transfer papers that moved Patricia Holloway's husband into my division office in Denver. But standing there under the rain with sheriff lights flashing across my porch, she had absolutely no idea who she was talking to. The younger deputy introduced himself as Deputy Collins while wiping rainwater off the brim of his hat with the back of his glove. He looked uncomfortable standing on my porch like he already sensed the situation was not as simple as Patricia Holloway had described over the phone. The older deputy stayed closer to the patrol SUV with one hand resting near his belt, while Patricia continued pacing through the mud behind them like she owned the entire mountain. In her mind, she probably thought she did. Sir, we received multiple complaints from the Homeowners Association regarding unauthorized structures, restricted shoreline access, and possible code violations, Collins explained carefully. I stepped aside and let the screen door swing open wider behind me. Warm air rolled out from the cabin carrying the smell of cedar smoke and fresh coffee. You can come in out of the rain, I said. Patricia immediately cut him off. Do not let him control the conversation, she snapped. These people know exactly how to manipulate law enforcement. Collins glanced awkwardly between us before stepping inside anyway. Water dripped from his boots onto the old pine floorboards while the storm rattled the windows hard enough to make the lantern hanging near the kitchen sway slightly. My cabin was not fancy. No marble countertops. No giant stone gates. Just hand-cut timber walls, old leather furniture, fishing gear near the fireplace, and 30 years of quiet that I had paid for with cash and patience. Patricia stepped in last, looking around with visible disgust. Her eyes moved slowly across every detail like she was inspecting contamination. "This is exactly what I warned the board about," she said. "People come in, build these little survivalist compounds, and drag down property values." I poured coffee into 3 mugs without responding. That irritated her more than if I had argued. People like Patricia fed on emotional reactions. Silence made them nervous. Collins accepted the mug with both hands. "Thank you, sir." Patricia did not take one. She was too busy spotting things she thought could be turned into accusations. Her attention locked onto the old encrypted receiver sitting beside my bookshelf. "There," she said quickly. "That is the equipment I reported." Collins walked over to it slowly. "Looks like a radio unit," he said. "It is a receiver," I answered calmly. Patricia folded her arms tighter. Why would someone living alone in the woods need encrypted communications equipment? I leaned against the counter and took a sip of coffee. "Depends on the job." She laughed again. Same sharp laugh from outside. The kind people use when they think they already won. "Your job," she said. "Let me guess. Former military? Private security? One of those guys who likes pretending he is still important." The rain intensified outside, pounding the roof so loudly it almost drowned out the sound of another vehicle climbing the gravel road below. Collins looked toward the window while Patricia kept talking. "The HOA has spent 8 months trying to identify who actually authorized this structure," she continued. "No approved architectural review. No shoreline committee clearance. No environmental inspection. Frankly, mister, I do not even think you belong in this community." I set my mug down beside the sink carefully. "Funny thing about communities," I said quietly. "Sometimes the people causing the most damage are the ones convinced they are protecting them." That hit a nerve immediately. Patricia stepped closer, heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "Do not get philosophical with me," she snapped. "I know exactly what kind of man you are." Behind her, through the rain-streaked front window, I noticed black headlights slowly appearing between the trees down near the shoreline road. Large SUV. Government issue suspension. Patricia had not seen it yet, but Deputy Collins had. And judging by the way his posture suddenly stiffened, he knew something important was about to change. The sound of the approaching SUV rolled through the trees low and heavy, different from the sheriff vehicles outside. Cleaner engine. Larger frame. Government fleet tires crunching slowly over soaked gravel. Deputy Collins moved toward the front window without realizing he was doing it. Patricia noticed immediately. "What now?" she asked sharply. Nobody answered her. The black SUV emerged from the fog near the shoreline and stopped 20 yards behind the patrol units. Headlights cut through the rain like white blades across the cabin walls. For a second the entire room went quiet except for the ticking of rainwater dripping from Collins's jacket onto my floor. Then Patricia straightened her posture again like she was preparing for an audience. "Good," she said with a relieved smile. "Finally. Someone competent." I already knew who was stepping out before the driver door even opened. Ethan Holloway always parked too straight. Perfect alignment every time. Training habit. The cabin lights reflected faintly across the wet federal plates as the door swung open and Ethan stepped into the storm wearing a dark field jacket over office clothes that looked rushed and half-buttoned. He had probably been asleep when Patricia called him. His shoes sank into the mud while he hurried toward the porch with one hand shielding his face from the rain. Patricia walked toward the front door immediately, almost excited now. "Ethan," she called out over the storm. "Thank God. These deputies have been standing around while this man keeps lying about ownership records." Collins shifted uncomfortably beside me. The older deputy outside suddenly removed his hat as Ethan climbed the porch steps. That was the first real clue Patricia missed. Federal people notice small respect signals. Most civilians never do. Ethan reached the doorway breathing hard from the climb and looked directly at me. Everything changed in his face instantly. The color drained so fast it was almost hard to watch. His shoulders locked. Eyes widened slightly. Then came the silence. Not confusion. Recognition. Patricia kept talking without noticing any of it. I told them this place needs to be searched properly, she continued. There are encrypted radios and locked government cases, and honestly the whole thing feels suspicious. Ethan never took his eyes off me. Sir, he said quietly. The room froze. Collins looked between us immediately. Patricia blinked once. Excuse me? She asked with a nervous laugh. Ethan swallowed hard. Rainwater dripped from his jacket onto the porch boards while the red and blue emergency lights flashed across his face through the open doorway. Sir, he repeated straighter this time. I did not know this was your property. Patricia stared at him like she had suddenly forgotten how language worked. Ethan, she said carefully, what are you talking about? He finally looked toward her, and I could see the exact moment he realized how bad this situation really was. Not because of me. Because of the deputies. The HOA complaints. The body cameras recording everything. The accusations. Patricia, he said slowly, this is Supervisory Special Agent Daniel Mercer. Even the rain outside seemed quieter after that sentence. Collins lowered his coffee mug carefully onto the counter without taking his eyes off Ethan. Patricia forced another small laugh, but this one sounded weak and brittle. Okay, she said. And Ethan looked physically uncomfortable now, like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. And he is my section chief. Nobody moved. The only sound inside the cabin was the crackle of wood shifting in the fireplace. Patricia's face tightened as she tried to process the words. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, trying to rearrange the hierarchy she had built this entire night around. A minute earlier she thought she was dragging some backwoods trespasser out of a cabin. Now she was standing in wet designer boots inside the home of the man who signed her husband's evaluations. Patricia looked at Ethan like he had just betrayed her in front of the entire mountain. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again while the flashing sheriff lights painted red streaks across the cabin walls behind her. Section chief? She repeated quietly. Ethan removed his soaked jacket slowly, buying himself time. I knew that habit too. He did it in meetings whenever he was trying to think 3 steps ahead before speaking. Patricia, he said carefully, you need to stop talking right now. That hit her harder than the reveal itself. Not because of the words but because of the tone. Until that moment she had been running the room entirely on confidence. Now even her own husband sounded nervous around me. Deputy Collins straightened his posture immediately. The older deputy outside stepped fully onto the porch and suddenly seemed very interested in keeping his voice respectful. Sir, Collins said to me quietly, we were not aware of your position. I shrugged once. You were responding to a call. Nothing wrong with that. Patricia turned toward me sharply. Position, she snapped. I do not care what agency he works for. This cabin still violates community regulations. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second like a man developing a headache in real time. Patricia, he warned again. But she was too deep into it now. Some people cannot reverse direction once pride takes over. They double down because admitting fault feels worse than disaster. She stepped toward the kitchen counter and grabbed a thick folder she had dropped earlier beside the coffee mugs. I have documents, she said defensively. Maps, complaints, photos. The board voted unanimously. Rain slammed against the windows hard enough to shake the glass while she spread papers across my table like a prosecutor presenting evidence. Shoreline restriction notices. Property sketches. HOA bylaws highlighted in yellow marker. Every page smelled faintly like printer toner and perfume. Collins glanced at the paperwork uncertainly before looking back at me. I could tell he was trying to figure out why a federal supervisor would choose to live alone in a 30-year-old timber cabin at the edge of a lake instead of somewhere protected behind gates and cameras. The answer was simple. Silence. After enough years working federal investigations, silence becomes expensive. Patricia stabbed one finger against a survey map. This structure extends 14 feet beyond approved shoreline boundaries, she declared. The board documented this months ago. I finally walked over and looked down at the papers. Then I noticed something almost funny. The map she was holding used the old property lines from before the county rezoned the lake access corridor 7 years earlier. She had spent months building a case using outdated records. I looked up at Ethan. He already knew. I could see it in his face. Patricia, he said slowly, Where exactly did the board get these documents? From the county records office, she answered immediately. Why? Ethan rubbed his forehead. Because those plats were replaced in 2019. The room went silent again. Patricia stared at him. No, she said flatly. That is impossible. No, I corrected calmly. It is expensive. She looked confused. I reached into the drawer beside the sink and pulled out a folded survey packet sealed in waterproof plastic. County certified. Updated shoreline measurements. Access easements. Federal environmental approval signatures. I handed it to Collins instead of Patricia. The cabin was rebuilt legally after the wildfire season in 2020, I explained. Every permit was approved through county and federal. Review. Collins opened the packet carefully while Patricia's face slowly lost color for the second time that night. The older deputy leaned closer to read over his shoulder. Everything checks out, Collins said after a moment. Patricia shook her head immediately. No. Somebody made a mistake. Ethan let out a tired breath. Yeah, he said quietly. Somebody definitely did. Outside, thunder rolled across the lake while the red and blue lights continued flashing through the fog. But inside the cabin the energy had completely shifted. A few hours earlier Patricia Holloway walked up that mountain convinced she controlled the narrative. Now she was standing in the middle of my kitchen realizing the entire case she built against me was collapsing one document at a time. Patricia stopped speaking after that. Not completely. People like her never really stopped talking. But the confidence was gone now, replaced by the shaky irritation of someone realizing the room no longer belonged to them. Deputy Collins handed the survey packet back to me carefully like it suddenly carried more weight than paper should. The older deputy cleared his throat awkwardly near the door. Looks like everything is in order here, sir, he said. The way he emphasized the word sir was impossible to miss. Patricia heard it too. Her eyes snapped toward him immediately. You cannot seriously be backing down because of his job title, she said. This is exactly how corruption starts. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. Nobody is backing down, he replied. You filed a complaint using outdated records. Because those were the records the HOA had access to, she shot back. Then the HOA should have verified them before sending county deputies to somebody's home after midnight, Ethan answered. That landed harder than he intended. Patricia stared at her husband in disbelief while rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of the porch roof outside. The storm had started to thin out over the lake, but the fog still hung low between the trees, turning the flashing sheriff lights into blurred streaks across the wet glass windows. I walked back toward the stove and poured fresh coffee into my mug while nobody spoke. Silence does strange things to people. Some grow calmer inside it. Others panic because they cannot control it. Patricia clearly belonged to the second category. You should have told them who you were from the beginning, she said finally, directing the accusation toward me now. I looked at her over the rim of my mug. You never asked. That answer irritated her more than any insult could have. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck while Collins pretended to study the paperwork again. Daniel, Ethan said carefully, his tone more professional now, I want to apologize for this situation. Patricia turned toward him instantly. Apologize, she repeated sharply. Ethan, these people have been violating community standards for years. These people, I repeated quietly. Patricia crossed her arms tighter. You know exactly what I mean. I nodded once. Yeah, I said. I think I do. Ethan looked like he wanted the floorboards to open beneath him. He knew that phrase was going to stay with me. Federal work trains you to remember patterns, not just evidence, behavior, tone, assumptions. Most investigations start long before anyone realizes they are being observed. Collins shifted awkwardly near the bookshelf and his eyes landed on a framed photograph partially hidden beside the fireplace. It showed 6 men standing in front of a federal operations trailer somewhere overseas. Younger versions of all of us, Ethan included. Collins looked at the photo, then at Ethan, then slowly back at me. You worked together a long time? He asked quietly. Ethan answered before I could. 11 years. Patricia blinked hard. Wait, she said slowly. You knew he lived here this whole time? Ethan hesitated too long before answering. That was enough confirmation by itself. Her expression changed instantly from anger to something colder. Embarrassment. Not private embarrassment either. Public embarrassment. The kind people feel when they realize everyone else in the room understands something before they do. "You let me come up here looking like an idiot," she whispered at him. Ethan looked exhausted now. "Patricia, I told you weeks ago to leave the cabin issue alone." Collins glanced up immediately at that sentence. "So did I." Patricia noticed it too and realized she had just exposed more than she intended. "That is not what you said," she argued quickly. "You said the owner had connections." Ethan gave a tired laugh without humor. "No," he replied quietly. "I said the owner signs federal clearance reviews." The cabin fell silent again except for the soft crackling of cedar logs burning behind the fireplace screen. Outside, the storm finally began drifting farther across the lake. But inside my kitchen, Patricia Holloway was starting to understand that this entire night had turned into the worst mistake of her life. Deputy Collins eventually stepped away from the table and quietly told the older deputy they could clear the call once the paperwork was documented correctly. The tension inside the cabin shifted after that. Not gone, just redirected. Earlier the deputies had walked in expecting a trespassing complaint. Now they were standing inside a legal property dispute tangled with federal credentials, county permit errors, and a homeowners association that apparently had no idea who they had been targeting for almost a year. Patricia stood near the fireplace with both arms folded tightly across her chest, staring at the floorboards while Ethan spoke quietly with Collins near the front door. I could hear fragments over the sound of rain dripping from the roof outside. "Body camera footage," Ethan muttered. "Chain of reporting." "No threats were made," Collins replied quickly. "Everything stayed calm." Ethan nodded once but still looked uneasy. He understood how these things worked. Federal personnel complaints did not always begin with criminal behavior. Sometimes they started with patterns: harassment, misuse of local systems, abuse of authority through unofficial channels. Patricia finally looked up at me again. The arrogance was mostly gone now, replaced by defensive frustration. "You could have stopped this entire thing hours ago," she said quietly. "I did," I answered. "Twice." She frowned. "What does that mean?" I leaned against the kitchen counter while thunder rolled far off across the lake. "The first time was when I ignored the HOA warning letters taped to my gate." Her expression tightened instantly. "Those were official notices." "No," I corrected calmly. "Those were printed threats with decorative signatures." Collins tried unsuccessfully to hide a reaction behind his coffee mug. Patricia noticed that too. Every minute inside the cabin seemed to make her position smaller. "And the second time?" she asked coldly. I looked directly at Ethan before answering. "The second time was when your husband drove up here 3 weeks ago and advised me not to escalate this." Patricia turned toward Ethan so fast her wet hair swung across her shoulder. "You came here." Ethan looked trapped now. "I was trying to prevent exactly this situation." "You never told me that." "Because I knew you would not listen." Silence settled over the room again. Real silence this time. Heavy. The kind that makes every small sound feel louder than normal. Firewood shifting in the stove. Rainwater tapping the gutters. The low electrical hum from the old refrigerator near the pantry wall. Patricia stared at her husband for several seconds before finally speaking again, but her voice sounded smaller now. "So everybody knew except me." Ethan looked exhausted. "Patricia, the board has been targeting the wrong person for months. Because nobody explained anything clearly." I almost smiled at that. "You never wanted an explanation," I said quietly. "You wanted control." That one landed. Her jaw tightened immediately, but she did not deny it. Outside, the deputies began preparing to leave. Red and blue lights reflected across the wet pine trees while fog drifted low over the lake shoreline. Collins stepped back inside one last time holding a small notepad. "Sir," he said respectfully, "we are marking the complaint as resolved due to verified ownership documentation." "Understood." He hesitated awkwardly before adding, "And for what it is worth, I am sorry this became a public issue." I nodded once. "You handled yourself professionally." Patricia looked away after hearing that. Even she understood what the sentence meant. The deputies had entered my cabin with more respect than she ever had. Collins gave Ethan a quick nod and stepped back outside into the cold night air. The older deputy followed him down the porch steps while the emergency lights continued washing color across the rain-soaked gravel road. Ethan remained near the doorway with both hands in his pockets, looking like a man mentally calculating how much damage tonight might still cause. Then his phone vibrated. He checked the screen and his expression immediately darkened. "What?" Patricia asked nervously. Ethan looked up slowly. The HOA board already posted about the investigation online. The cabin suddenly felt much quieter than before. Because now this was no longer just an embarrassing mistake inside one mountain home. Now there was a public record. The moment Ethan said the HOA board had already posted about the investigation online, Patricia's face lost what little confidence she still had left. Her eyes widened slightly, not with fear exactly, but with the realization that this mess had escaped the walls of my cabin. Public embarrassment hits different in wealthy lake communities. People there can tolerate lawsuits, fines, even affairs sometimes. But humiliation? Public humiliation spreads faster than wildfire through neighborhoods built on appearances. Ethan unlocked his phone again and scrolled silently, while the glow from the screen reflected across his tired face. "They posted photos," he said quietly. "Pictures of the sheriff vehicles outside." Patricia immediately grabbed for the phone. "Let me see that." Ethan pulled it back before she could touch it. No, that single word landed harder than any argument they had exchanged all night. Patricia stared at him in disbelief. "Excuse me. You need to stop reacting emotionally and start thinking clearly," Ethan said. "The board thinks this is some HOA enforcement victory. They do not understand what they just attached your name to." I stayed quiet near the stove while the fire crackled softly behind me. That was another thing people misunderstand about power. Real authority rarely needs to announce itself. It just waits while everyone else talks too much. Patricia turned toward me suddenly. "Are you threatening the board now?" I shook my head. "Once. No." "Then why does everyone keep acting like this is some federal crisis?" I looked at her calmly. "Because you involved county law enforcement in a false property complaint against a federal supervisor, after ignoring corrected county records for almost a year." She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. Somewhere deep down she finally understood the difference between neighborhood authority and official authority. One exists because people agree to follow it. The other exists whether you respect it or not. Ethan slowly lowered the phone onto the kitchen table. "The post already has comments," he said quietly. Collins paused near the doorway. "Comments from who?" Ethan gave a humorless laugh. "Residents." Patricia crossed her arms defensively again. "Good. Maybe now people will finally see how irresponsible this cabin situation has been." Ethan looked genuinely stunned by that answer. "Patricia, there are already people asking why deputies were sent out here after midnight without verified records." That finally broke through her anger. She looked at him carefully now. "What are you saying?" "I am saying the board documented and publicly shared an active law enforcement response tied to false information." The room fell silent again except for rain dripping steadily from the porch roof outside. Patricia slowly sat down at the kitchen table for the first time all night. Earlier she had moved through my cabin like she owned it. Now she looked smaller somehow. The storm had drained out of her voice. Ethan picked up the phone again and rubbed his forehead while reading. "Somebody uploaded the old shoreline maps," he muttered. "And somebody else already posted the corrected county survey." Collins frowned slightly. "That fast?" Ethan nodded once. Small communities move fast online. I finally walked over and glanced at the screen. The neighborhood forum was already splitting apart in real time. Half the comments defended Patricia and the board. The other half were asking uncomfortable questions about harassment complaints, selective enforcement, and why my property had been targeted repeatedly while larger violations near the marina had apparently been ignored for years. Patricia saw my expression change slightly. "What?" she asked nervously. I handed the phone back to Ethan. "Looks like your HOA has bigger problems than my cabin." Ethan read another comment and quietly exhaled through his nose. "Oh no," he muttered. Patricia stood up immediately. "What now?" Ethan looked at her for several long seconds before answering. Someone just posted the board email chain. Even the fireplace seemed quieter after that. Because everybody in that cabin understood exactly what leaked emails could do in a community built entirely on private conversations and controlled narratives. Patricia grabbed Ethan's phone so fast this time he did not stop her. Her hands were shaking slightly as she scrolled through the neighborhood forum, while rain hissed softly against the windows behind us. I watched her expression change line by line. First confusion, then disbelief, then panic. "Who posted these?" she whispered. Ethan took the phone back and read quietly for several seconds before answering. "Looks like someone from the board leaked the internal discussion thread." Patricia looked genuinely stunned now. "Why would anybody do that?" Ethan gave her a tired look. "Probably because those emails are bad, Patricia." She folded her arms defensively again. "Bad how?" Ethan turned the screen toward her without speaking. Even from across the kitchen I could see highlighted sections from the board conversations. Complaints about my type of resident. Suggestions about increasing pressure until I sold the property voluntarily. Discussions about using county inspectors repeatedly until the cabin situation resolved itself. Collins, still standing near the doorway, slowly lowered his eyes after reading part of the thread over Ethan's shoulder. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. The words on that screen spoke loudly enough already. Patricia shook her head immediately. Those comments were taken out of context. I almost smiled at that because people always say that once private conversations become public. Ethan scrolled farther down the thread. "There is more." Patricia looked exhausted now. "Of course there is." He read silently for another moment before looking directly at her. "You told the board I was handling federal concerns personally?" Patricia blinked hard. "I was trying to reassure them." Ethan stared at her in disbelief. "You used my position to pressure residents?" "No," she snapped quickly. "I simply explained that you worked in federal law enforcement." Ethan rubbed his forehead again. "Patricia, that is exactly what you were not supposed to do." Outside, the sheriff vehicles finally shut off their emergency lights, leaving only pale moonlight reflecting across the wet gravel road and fog drifting low through the trees. The cabin suddenly felt darker without the constant flashing colors. Collins quietly adjusted his jacket near the front door. "Sir," he said to me carefully, "I think we should probably clear the scene." I nodded once. "Appreciate your professionalism tonight, Deputy." He hesitated before leaving. "For what it is worth," he said quietly, "a lot of folks around this county are getting tired of HOA politics up here." Patricia looked down at the table after hearing that. Even local deputies apparently had opinions about the board now. Collins tipped his hat respectfully and stepped outside into the cold night air with the older deputy following behind him. Their patrol vehicles slowly rolled down the mountain road a minute later, headlights fading through the pine trees until only silence remained around the cabin. Ethan stayed near the doorway for several seconds after they left. He looked trapped between two worlds now. Federal professionalism on one side, marriage on the other. "Daniel," he said finally, "I want you to know I never shared anything confidential with the board." "I know." Patricia looked up sharply. "How exactly would you know that?" I took another slow sip of coffee before answering. Because if Ethan had crossed that line, he would not still have a clearance. That shut the room down instantly. Patricia stared at me across the kitchen table while the fire cracked softly behind us. For the first time all night she looked less angry than afraid. Not afraid of me personally. Afraid of consequences. Real consequences. The kind that stay on records. Ethan slowly sat down across from her and spoke more quietly than before. "Do you understand how serious this became tonight?" Patricia looked at the dark window beside the fireplace instead of answering. Her reflection stared back at her faintly in the glass. Wet hair. Smudged makeup. Expensive raincoat thrown over the chair beside her. Nothing about her looked powerful anymore. Just tired. "The board wanted somebody to blame for falling property values," she said finally. "And they picked the cabin." I nodded once. "That happens a lot." Ethan looked at her carefully. "The problem is that now people are going to start asking why." Outside, the storm had finally passed beyond the lake completely, but inside my cabin the real damage was only beginning to surface. 3 weeks later the mountain looked completely different. Early morning sunlight cut through the pine trees around the lake, turning the remaining fog gold above the water while fresh cedar boards dried beside my rebuilt dock. The storm from that night was long gone, but people in communities like ours never really move on from public scandals. They preserve them, retell them over wine glasses and golf carts and neighborhood meetings until the story becomes part of the landscape itself. I stood near the shoreline tightening bolts into a support beam when I heard tires crunch slowly over the gravel road again. This time there were no sirens, no flashing lights, just one dark SUV pulling quietly beside the cabin. Ethan stepped out first holding a cardboard coffee tray from the diner down in town. He looked older than he had 3 weeks earlier. Stress does that to people faster than age ever could. Patricia climbed out a few seconds later, but even from 30 feet away I could tell something about her had changed. The confidence was gone now. Not hidden. Gone. She wore jeans instead of designer clothes and carried no folders, no printed bylaws, no phone in her hand documenting evidence for the board. Just silence. Ethan walked down toward the dock first while Patricia stayed farther back near the trees. "Morning, sir," Ethan said quietly. I nodded once. "Morning." He handed me one of the coffee cups. Black. No sugar. He still remembered. "Board voted her out 2 days ago," he said after a moment. I looked toward Patricia standing alone near the gravel road. I heard. Everybody heard. The leaked email chain had detonated the homeowners association within 48 hours. Residents started digging into old complaints, selective enforcement records, marina contracts, landscaping fines, even budget discrepancies buried inside years of meeting notes. Once people stop fearing authority, they start examining it. That is the dangerous part. Ethan stared out across the lake. "There is an external audit now," he said quietly. "County oversight too." I took a slow sip of coffee while morning wine pushed ripples across the water. Communities usually clean themselves up once sunlight hits the right places. Ethan laughed softly under his breath. "You always talk like that when somebody destroys themselves." I did not destroy anybody. He looked at me carefully. "No," he admitted. "You just stayed still long enough for them to do it themselves." Behind him, Patricia finally started walking toward the dock. Slow steps across wet gravel. No anger left in them. When she reached the edge of the shoreline, she stopped a few feet away from me without making eye contact at first. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. I waited. People reveal the truth eventually if you let silence do the work. "I thought this cabin represented everything wrong with the community," she admitted. "I convinced myself I was protecting property values." I looked around at the trees, the lake, the old timber walls behind us. "This cabin survived 2 wildfires, a flood season, and 20 Montana winters," I said calmly. "It was never the problem." She nodded slowly. "I know that now." Another silence settled over the shoreline, but this one felt different from the others. Less hostile. More exhausted. Ethan glanced at his watch before looking back at me. "There is one more thing," he said carefully. "The board president resigned this morning too." I smiled faintly at that. Not because I enjoyed watching people fall. Because systems eventually reveal exactly what they are built on. Fear. Ego. Control. Or integrity. Patricia stared out across the lake while wind moved softly through the pine branches overhead. "Why did you never fight back publicly?" she asked quietly. I looked toward the sunlight reflecting off the water beside the dock. Because real power does not panic when somebody mistakes silence for weakness. Nobody spoke after that. The lake stayed calm. The mountains stayed quiet. And for the first time since Patricia Holloway drove deputies up my road in the middle of the night, the entire community finally understood who had actually belonged there all along.